Good morning, everyone. It looks like it's 11 o'clock, so let's go ahead and start this presentation. We have a couple of changes. One, the last presentation, traffic calming devices, studies, and inventory management, will not be taking place. However, the first two presentations have decided that they can expand, so you will have a full hour of presentation. I want to remind everybody off to the right is the chat window to chat with other participants and a Q&A box to answer and input all of your questions. That will be moderated by my co-host, Robert Bush. And hopefully we will have a lot of questions for the speakers. The first topic that we're going to cover here is by Sage Donaldson. Sage is a GIS and HPMS analyst from the Arizona Department of Transportation, ADOT. She's a project manager and GIS analyst in the data analytics group. She has a BS in environmental studies and geography from the U of A. And her responsibilities include producing and assisting in data visualizations, coordinating with local agencies and other groups, gathering data for report purposes, and transportation GIS data analysis and mapping. She's an active member of AGIC, yay, and also the Women in GIS Arizona chapter. Her topic today is finding your audience using AGOL apps to appeal to an audience. Sage, take it away.
Awesome, thank you, Teresa. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick. All right, so if everybody can see my screen, I'll go ahead and proceed with my presentation today. So like Teresa said, I'm gonna do my best to stretch this out as best as I can. But today I'm gonna talk about how you should find and cater your applications to the audience that you're marketing them to, and how to do that, and just some tips and tricks that I've learned through the past few years to best cater applications and best find the audience that you're looking for. And so I'm going to give some background on myself here, but when I started at the Department of Transportation, there were not story maps and not really public facing metadata for users outside of ADOT. So one of the things that my boss, James Meyer, tasked me with was producing story maps of these really complex data items and really specific items that we work on. How I had to start doing that was parsing through really intricate metadata and trying to turn that into some kind of usable public-facing high-level format. And so my first few attempts through that were hard because I was trying to parse through this really in-depth process-based metadata to produce something for people outside of our transportation GIS industry specific to ADOT. And so going through that process, I kind of came up with this idea of how to find your audience, how to market your experience to your audience, and then how to cater all that application-based stuff to your audience, and how to make that really discernible information depending on who you're even marketing. And so that's kind of the impetus to my presentation today is how I kind of went through that process, and now how I can give information on how to best do that. So to get into it, no matter what data you're curating, you're likely to have a variety of customers and users. So it's important to know how to find that audience and how to build on your audience. But identifying your audience can be admittedly pretty difficult. So some ideas to keep in mind as you go through your first step, before you even start crafting your application or your monologue, I suppose, is who do you picture viewing the data? Why is someone using it? What's their day-to-day use of it? So are they going to it every day? Is it a one-time thing? You know, how often are they using it? And how much extra information is there to understand the data? So is there a lot of background that they need in order to understand the data that you're giving them? Or is it pretty easy? Does it kind of explain itself? And so these are some questions to even start thinking through before you even begin crafting your experience, so your customer experience. And I've, throughout this presentation, as a kind of way to show this, you'll notice I'm actually doing this presentation in a story map. And this is a slide-based story map. But here, this is an example, excuse me, of a survey 123 that we put out for AGIC as a way to try to get involvement of who would want to participate in in-person meetups. And so catering even in that end. So when you found your audience, when you've targeted who you think is going to use the data and who is going to participate in that data, then you have to think about the application itself and catering that application to best fit the needs of that audience. And so maybe that application is a dashboard, maybe that application is a story map, maybe it's something really simple like a fact sheet or a white page. But it's really important to kind of find the niche that you sit in for that application. So here I've got an experience builder. This is a dashboard embedded into an experience builder. So it allows you to kind of navigate the data in a way that best suits you, right? And so this dashboard, for instance, is really made for external customers who need information about bridge condition data. And so this application really caters to that aspect. And this can be for state government, and this can be for local government. So this, for instance, has a wide breadth of users that can do this, but you could simplify this to a story map that is just a map or just a web app builder. So what's important is to understand what applications are at your disposal and what would best suit the needs of your customer and who that customer is. So now I'm going to go into just some tips and tricks for finding your audience and catering your applications for that audience. And so my first tip and trick for this is to keep it high level. GIS is often very complicated and really complex, so keeping the data information really high level is really important. There's obviously a lot of circumstances where the data needs to be kept at its complexity, but being able to pare down the information associated with your data is an important task to go through when you're putting together applications and finding your audience to deliver data and information to. So how do you keep your data at a high level? Or how do you keep the information associated with your data at a high level? Firstly is to identify the most important fields or items in your data. So what are the really big things that you need to know in order to get what you need out of the data? So if you're looking at bridge condition to pull from the last example, what are the big things you need to know? So if I were identifying, you need to know the condition of the bridge or the quality of the bridge or something like that. So it's identifying those key fields that you need and then what you need to know about those key fields. The next is to identify the message your data serves and keep to that information. So what message are you trying to get across? What information do you want your user and your customer of your data to know? So identify that and then really stick on track with that. And lastly is to layer or build on that information. So deliver your data in a narrative. So if your endpoint is to explain, in this instance, this is a highway performance monitoring system story map, and it talks about this federal report. So if my goal is to provide information on this specific federal reporting, and I'm going to start kind of at a lower level, and I'm going to build upon that. Of course, my mouse isn't working now, but so it's layering and building on that data and that information in order to get your big picture. The next tip is to despecify your data. Data is usually really specific to industries and processes. So when you're sharing data, it's really important to despecify it and turning your data into information. So tips to do that is to generalize, finding aspects of your data that pertain to many different subjects. So seeing where your data relates to other areas, whether that's business uses or decision-making ideas, and give the idea and options on how the data can be used. So applications, where can they use this data? How can they analyze this data in order to get what they need out of it. And so how do you provide the information so that that can be used? And so a good way to think about this is to de-specify it, is to make it as kind of general as possible. So don't make it incredibly process-based. So take these steps out of it in theory. Another idea to that is to give a list of information items that they can pull on to make the data more specific to their uses or to make it specific to a broader case. Next is to standardize the information. So standardizing the information that you are distributing makes the data easier to consume. So by providing standard definitions across the board, your overall data quality will improve. This is an important piece to data governance. Effective standardization defines processes, policies, and maintains data and security. So this is kind of showing this trickle down effect that you are creating standard information for maybe a public use or a wider audience than you're used to, but seeing that it trickles down through your own data management is what's really important. By putting in the standardized processes and standardized information and definitions, you're allowing for better data sharing and more effective data and information, regardless of what you're working on. So what types of data and information are available to you? Your audience is going to change depending on the information you need to deliver. So identifying that information and how users need to understand it is really important. And so figuring out the types of information that they need and in what way they need it, and what way they need it delivered to them. Is it a map? Is it a story map? But identifying those types is really important. And I've categorized those into a few different ways. So is it a data visualization? So this allows for visualizations and allows to manipulate complex data items so that a user can kind of use the data to their best. So is your customer, is your audience needing to interact with the data itself? Do they need to come in here and be able to filter and see an actual data item and get into it and click and such? So is that your point to your data? A tutorial is my next category for data and information sharing. So is it a tutorial? Is it a step-by-step process that your users need to be able to go through and follow in order to complete an application, or in this case, a change request of some type? Tutorials can be easily transferred into story maps, and they can be made public really easily. So you can allow for a lot of self-service by transitioning, maybe traditionally PDF-based tutorials into story maps, or just kind of having an idea of how you think the user will need to walk through a tutorial. So that's another category. The next is it a coordinative effort? Is your audience, is the reason for your audience needing to have this information because you need better coordination with that group of people? So, this is including reasons for that coordination and what exactly you need from them. I know here at ADOT, we have a pretty big need for coordinating about when construction projects are finished. And so the audience here was explaining why we need this coordination, some of the data so they can kind of contextualize it, and then explaining the kind of complexities to what we're asking. And then our follow-up, our impetus to this is to ask them to give us information, so give us their data essentially. And so is that what you're going for? Is your audience really a push and pull between your two teams or your two coordination? Next is a training tool. This is pretty similar to tutorials, except you gear trainings towards maybe internal staff. So it allows platforms to be really interactive. And so one of the things that's really useful when you're learning something new or training on something brand new is to be able to interact directly with the data. So trainings really allow for trainings in this platform, or catering what you're doing to allow for better training, really makes your overall data users or information users get a better grasp of what you're trying to get. Another category is an analysis. This can describe an analysis or a project scope or outcome, and it allows the readers or users to understand the analysis that took place while also being able to view the data. So have you finished a big project and you're trying to describe the accomplishments that came out of that project, or the advancements or the data that you found? Are you recommending a new way of doing things? So that's really what I have found to be really awesome as far as identifying who I'm looking at, because I can really cater what information that we gleaned out of a process, or what information they need to know moving forward, based upon whatever analytical process I've done. Is it metadata? Are you generalizing or creating publicly consumed metadata? So this displays information at a high level and allows for more accessibility and easy to understand for those outside of a specific industry. So are you taking your metadata, kind of like I talked about at the beginning, but are you taking your really complex list formatted, process oriented metadata and turning it into a publicly consumable, informative applications, so that users can then, go download your data from AZGO or something like that, and understand what they're looking at and understand how they should be using the data, to their own needs or to what the agency needs. So, are you transforming metadata? And so that's all I had for today. I wanted to sort of expand on a few ideas in here, though, since I have some extra time, and I'll use my last few minutes here. But another really good use of AGOL applications and finding your audience that I found is in our new AGIC mentoring program that's going to start up here soon, that Patrick and Shay have introduced. So in this case, the audience was a lot broader and applied to a lot of different people, and the depth of it really changed quite a bit. So in this case, I kind of wanted to show this story map that I put together with the help of a lot of people. But so the point of this one kind of changed a lot, because it was catering to an audience of mentees. So of, maybe some students, someone really new into GIS or doesn't know what they're doing yet. And then also catered to really cemented GIS professionals, and was trying to grasp both audiences and trying to reel in both of them. And so this application is really dynamic and really unique because it's trying to pull in both of those. And so I wanted to show this as a way to kind of describe an instance where maybe your audience is actually two very different audiences. And so going through that prescribed, who is your audience, find it, and, go through the steps to catering it, even if you're catering it to two very different groups of people or groups of users. You can go through the same steps, but you just kind of relay things differently, and, have to find different ways to expand on ideas and processes. But I think with that, that's really all I have for today. So I will hand it back to Teresa or Robert for any questions.
Thank you, Sage. I don't show any questions right now. We got some compliments in the chat session, but no one has posted any questions or anything like that. So
Robert,
we'll leave it open again.
Robert, this is Teresa.
Yeah.
Click on the approved, not just the appending.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
I do see some. Thank you. Sage, our first question is, do you have to build user guides for customers to learn how to use your apps, or have you found most people find the apps simple enough to learn how to use them on their own?
Yeah, it kind of depends, depending on the application. Sort of going back to that targeted audience, there are times when, you know, a lot like things like the tutorials where we're asking our users to do a process. That when we do that, we do I do put a lot more how-tos, I guess, into the applications. So it kind of depends on what I'm working on or what we're trying to get at. But there are a lot of instances where the kind of the impetus to put the information out there is for the users to be able to do it on their own. So so it kind of depends on who I'm looking at, I guess, if that helps.
Yeah, sounds good. Our next question is, do your story maps or tutorials, as you like to call them, link to lots of outside data besides ADOT data? And how do you list that in your story maps when updated, et cetera?
Yeah, so there's a lot of instances where we are using data outside of ADOT. One of the things that I've really tried to lean on is using the data owner's authoritative data sources. So I lean a lot on AZGeo, and I'll take the feature service right from AZGeo. So when it gets updated, I kind of know immediately because either my application breaks or the data has been updated on AZGeo itself. For ADOT specific data, I have a kind of internal cadence of when I update data items, because we do link to a lot of data sources that don't exist specifically in that application. So it kind of is the cadence at which the data gets updated, but I lean a lot on AZGeo as a way to import data into these different applications.
All righty, thank you, Sage. Our last question is, what would be the best way to find your target audience?
Yeah, so the things that I like to do is put myself in the place of who that target audience might be, I guess. So I really like to do the exercise of physically who do I picture viewing the data? Who do I picture needing the data? How does it apply to that person? So if I picture, maybe if I picture myself, how does that data really apply to that person, and how often is someone using that data? So targeting that audience starts with identifying that audience itself, and then going through these kind of step-by-step questions to say, well, how does it apply to them? Well, they just need to read what pavement condition is. Okay, well, then I know, so I kind of just need to put together a really comprehensive high-level story map or some other kind of application. It doesn't have to be even an AGOL application, but starting with who that person is really helps to then narrow down how to target them specifically, and then what application to go through to best target them, to make it easier for them to get the information that I want them to have.
Okay. Well, that's it for questions. I will turn it over. If you don't have any last words, Sage, I'll turn it over to Teresa, who's hosting this meeting. Teresa, are you available?
I am. Thank you, Robert. And you know, this is all about the presenters and the sessions and you guys getting all this great data and information from them. Robert and I are part of the AJ conference committee, and we're just here to facilitate that. So that's why I'm not doing introductions, but we're here to help. So our next presenter, and let me remind you, Gabe and Carrie, that you have the full half hour plus an extra 5 minutes if you want. So their talk is going to be about processing the large backlog of cultural resource data. This is going to be presented by Gabe McGowan, who is the database specialist at AZSITE, along with his co-presenter, Carrie Schmidt, who is a GIS professional at ASM. Over to you, Gabe.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. There we go. Okay, so as Teresa mentioned, I'm Gabe McGowan. I'm the AZSITE database specialist, and I have with me Carrie Schmidt, our GIS professional, and we're going to be discussing how we've gone about processing a large backlog of cultural resource data into our production databases. So I wanted to start out kind of at a high level before we get into the details. So we have a backlog. These are submissions of data that never made it into our production databases, which serve a couple of web applications and an ArcGIS server with feature services as well. And so some of the key strategies and tactics that we've used in addressing this backlog is, one, to conduct initial characterization of our backlog, and then use those techniques to then provide continuing status tracking and provide transparency to our users on the status of the backlog. We also use a lot of batch processing and scripting techniques to scale up our processes and handle more data at a time. We have taken several approaches with provisional data, thinking about what partial or temporary data we can get processed quickly to provide some information to our users, while we then come back through behind and process the complete entries. Another key idea is thinking about the administrative framework in which you're working. So in our case, we have our data carry with them compliance implications and regulatory implications. So we're just thinking about how we can work within that framework. Are there pieces of data that we can accelerate getting online while other pieces are still working, matriculating through those processes? And then also going back to some of Sage's presentation, thinking about the use cases of these data, and based on those use cases, how can we again think about partial data or provisional data that will provide value to our users while we're working on the complete data in the backlog. And then finally, thinking about alternative data sources, identifying other possible sources besides your pool of data in your backlog, where you can acquire, say, parts of your data that are already complete and already in a consistent digital format, so that you can accelerate upload of those items.
Okay, so let's start off with a bit of background. AZSITE is a geodatabase for cultural resources recorded in Arizona and also a 40-mile buffer around the state. Cultural resources are indicators of past human activities, or they can have a significance to a culture, including existing cultures. These can be archaeological sites, structures, objects, landscapes, and even natural features. The AZSITE Consortium was founded in 1997 as an effort to combine cultural resource data from different agencies operating in the state. So current consortium members are the Arizona State Museum, which houses the AZSITE staff, as well as several cultural resource management offices, such as for permitting and collections for state land. Other members include Arizona State University, the State Historic Preservation Office, and the Museum of Northern Arizona. So the main goal of AZSITE is to assist archaeologists in their work in protecting cultural resources. AZSITE is primarily used in work for compliance with state and federal laws, which are concerned with protecting cultural resources during projects and undertakings. I could get into the weeds about all the different kind of things that trigger this, but ultimately, if there's a project going on, most likely it needs some kind of archaeological research ahead of time. AZSITE's also used in property development due diligence and also in academic research. So our core data is available to users through web applications and an ArcGIS server feature service. Users are able to access core geometry layers and their associated attributes. The first of which is the project layer, which is shown in the figure in blue. These are our archaeological surveys, excavations, monitoring, boundaries, which are represented in the official record. The attributes associated with these are typically just the organization responsible for the project dates, and any relevant permit numbers. The next core layer are the archaeological sites layer. So these are our site boundaries, which are also as reflected in the official record. The attributes for this layer are going to be more extensive. They typically can have cultural and temporal classifications, so culture and date and time, as well as the artifacts and features present, and sometimes different evaluations specifically for the National Register for Historic Places. So the third core data layer is called the advanced sites layer. So as opposed to polygons, these are points, which might be difficult to see, but they're bright green points. These are generated from site UTM coordinates that are taken from submission material. These points are published before a site boundary has been processed and approved, and is available to help our users know that even without a boundary, there are cultural resources located in this vicinity, and you need to be aware. AZSITE also provides documents. So these are the official records, which are site cards for sites, and then a project registration form for projects. Okay, so before diving into the backlog, it's important to note how AZSITE obtains the data. So AZSITE is technically downstream from the Archaeological Records Office, known as the ARO. The ARO is the official record repository for archaeological surveys and sites that are generated under work conducted on state lands. State lands include state land that is owned by the state, also county and municipal lands, and it is mandated that this data be submitted to the ARO. Part of this process, archaeologists will report their project, their newly discovered sites, and or updates to previously recorded sites as part of their submission. The ARO assigns the official project and site numbers, which are going to stick with these projects and sites till the end of time, basically. Once processed and approved, the ARO passes these submissions and records to AZSITE. So the majority of AZSITE data comes to the ARO, but we also accept data from agencies and other companies that are not required to go through this process. So the backlog is officially defined as data submitted before July 1st, 2018. So this date was when fee structures went into effect, a new fee structure went into effect. And we just use it as kind of a watershed of before data was submitted before this date is the backlog, and afterward is not. And specifically, this is data that has not been processed or fully uploaded to AZSITE. So that backlog is approximately 7,800 sites and 2,500 projects. So how did we get this backlog? So the backlog is the result of several different factors, one of which is the heterogeneous nature of the data. When you get data from a lot of different agencies and organizations, sometimes fitting them all together is a little difficult. Also worsening software incompatibilities from upgrades or lack thereof over time. Also understaffing. Up until recently, the only permanent staff member for AZSITE was the AZSITE manager. There were temporary positions in the past, but those were always on a short-term basis. So these issues contributed to the backlog, which became recognized as a problem in the early to mid 2000s. So these issues and also kind of a lack of immediate solution to these issues led to the backlog as we know it today.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. And I also just wanted to mention, if you're a GIS professional and you're looking at this slide, you're probably thinking that is not that much data. But the reason it becomes an issue is that these, particularly the site boundaries, carry with them such significant compliance and financial and human implications. These boundaries represent our history in this state and the history of a lot of the tribal entities in the state as well. So those boundaries are taken very serious, and we're downstream of the ARO, and they curate those boundaries and the site records, and that's kind of considered their work product. So they put a lot of effort into those curating those submissions as well. So starting out, I started in my position in January 2020. At that point, we did not really know what progress had been made on this backlog. The ARO had maintained a backlog list in their internal database. So the first step was to, basically use Python to establish database connections and run some list comprehensions to see where we were at with our backlog. And that technique, now we use that to provide ongoing updates to our users. So these are time series plots that we update on our website a couple times a month, just showing progress over time and getting this data into AZSITE. And part of this initial characterization was completing an inventory of the components of a submission. So the key components from our perspective are shapefiles for the geospatial data, and then what was termed an entry module, which is a little Microsoft Access database with a set of forms that was used to collect the detailed attribute data. So we have, like Carrie mentioned, the submissions are very heterogeneous. There are those that are only paper submissions. There are those that are only PDFs. And then there are those that have one or both of these electronic data components that we need to upload. Okay, so I'm gonna be revisiting this little timeline over the course of the presentation. So, starting in January 2020, we didn't really know where we're at. We did some work to do some initial characterization. At that point, we had 5% of our projects uploaded, and we had 7% of our backlog sites uploaded, and then we had an additional 35% of those sites present in that advanced sites points layer, which is kind of a provisional layer representing those sites in some way with a point rather than a polygon. And so that layer is meant to represent newly recorded sites. So an organization will do a project. If they find new sites on state land, they will request from ASM an ASM site number. And as part of that process, they will provide center point coordinates, and then those coordinates make their way into our database. So it's meant to represent kind of recent field work that was done. But it does provide a convenient holding place for our backlog sites. In 2020, we were thinking that at that point, the thought was we should not upload boundaries for backlog sites until they went through the full curation process in the ARO, the associated site card record. So dumping backlog sites center points into this layer was a way that we could represent those site recordings in our database while the curation process was still ongoing, so that we didn't have the implication from our data that there were not resources in locations where there had been recorded resources. So we used Python to conduct a data mining operation, looking in our submission folders, using regular expressions to identify likely site shapefiles, and then within those site shapefiles, likely site number fields, and then using GeoPandas to grab those individual features, be they typically polygons, sometimes lines, and sometimes points as well. And then using ArcPy to calculate an interior center point for those, because there were a large number of these backlog sites where the center points had not been submitted originally. So there was also some manual processing as well for the paper records or submissions without geometries, where we went in and digitized points by hand. So that was an effort we undertook in the spring of 2020. So here's our change in progress between January and July of 2020. In terms of projects, we uploaded 6% of our projects. In terms of sites, we went from 35% of our backlog sites in the advanced sites layer to 91%. So that gave us 99% coverage of our sites in at least provisional form. So that was, we could breathe a sigh of relief there that we were at least more or less representing our data set in some form. So then in September 2020, Carrie was hired. We had more people power to work on this. And we were approved by ASM to begin uploading site boundaries prior to completion of the curation process. So that means we can upload a full site entry. It will not have the associated site card PDF record. And we'll put a caveat in there that this is, the curation is still pending, but that we were able to do this on condition that we would review the boundary against the report that was submitted with the submission. So that was really a big change to our admin framework that really allowed us to ramp up our approach to the backlog. And then we began applying a lot of batch processing techniques. So we use Python to compile batches of working materials. We use Python to clean those entry modules, those Microsoft Access databases. Those had evolved over time, but there wasn't a versioning system. So there would be discrepancies in field types, data types, relationships within those databases that in turn were causing problems for the previously existing upload tools. So we're using Python to clean all of those up front as we begin working on a batch of uploads, using PyODBC library as well as the ADODB API library. And then, of course, there's also some manual processing, digitization, checking those boundaries against the reports, and some data entry as well. And with that data entry, we really went through a process of prioritizing what is considered essential data for an upload to be complete. What do we sort of jettison or leave behind until we get the full curated record at some point in the future? And that sped things up as well. And then we developed our batch upload scripts, again, using Python so that we can process, large numbers of projects with their associated sites at a time. So having done all that work, by January of this year, in terms of projects, we had gone from 11% uploaded in July to 20% in January. In terms of sites, we had gone from 8% fully uploaded to nearly a quarter fully uploaded in January. So pretty good progress. But by spring of this year, we were feeling pretty good about our progress on the sites, but we were feeling that our projects we were going too slow on the projects. And that was kind of because we were thinking about everything at the project level. So each project carries with it a number of sites, or not each project, but many projects. And so we were going through and doing one project at a time with the associated sites, prioritizing projects with a lot of sites. So the sites progress was going quite a bit faster than the projects. At that point, we started thinking about our use cases. How do people actually use our database? I had been reluctant to decouple project uploads from site uploads because the feeling was that if we upload a project without the associated sites, the implication could be that that project did not find sites. While that might not be the case, and we don't want people getting the idea that there are no resources where there are in fact resources. But the way people use our database is primarily from a spatial perspective. So they have a work area and they're using our web map or our ArcGIS server to look at that area and see what's going on. So if they see a project boundary, they will then pull up that project PDF record, which we have the complete data set, all of the PDF records for projects. It is the site records that those PDFs require curation. And that project PDF will show any sites associated with it, which they can then cross-reference with the advanced sites points and see what's going on. We have requested a development of more explicit links there in our applications that I wanted to get pushed through before making this step, but it was, we don't have development access on our production servers, and the people who do did not have the time to devote to that to date. So we went ahead and pushed forward. So what makes this so powerful is that we can obtain a complete project entry in terms of attributes from web and internal database sources. So we can scrape all of that data. And we can then compile geometries using Python with ArcPy, go through those project submission folders. We have a supervised script that will go through, identify likely project shapefiles, eliminate any that are empty. And then if there's more than one, ask you which ones to keep. If it's a line or point, ask you if you'd like to keep it, if you'd like to buffer it, what the buffer distance would be, because we want to arrive at a single polygon feature per project. So the benefit of this bulk project upload, we can make a lot of project progress. The data are considered kind of provisional until we come back through and do a second pass fully vetting those. And when we do that, then we upload the associated site. So this also speeds up the sites process as well. And I'm going to let Carrie talk a bit about that.
Sure. So as Gabe said, the second pass is kind of a last verification stage. The first part of that is just checking that the project uploaded correctly, matched the official record. Sometimes it does not, sometimes things might need to be tweaked. And then following that is for sites. We check the geometry. If it does not exist, then it is geo-referenced from report maps or hand-drawn maps, sometimes automated just from site dimensions. And also just checking the same thing with attributes that were submitted. If they do not exist, then they are manually entered.
Okay, so then coming back to our timeline, you know, here we are in October 2021. In terms of projects, we're now at 81% of our projects have been uploaded using that decoupling of projects and sites approach. And in terms of sites, we now have 2/3 of our sites fully uploaded. So we've made a lot of progress in the last 6 months or so.
Okay, so moving forward, we have some ongoing developments. Most of all is to kind of take these techniques that we've been developing and then apply them to these newer non-backlog submissions, which do come in kind of on a regular basis as projects are ongoing in the state. Also followed by kind of moving our submission process to web forms, which will make it more efficient and likely more attractive to our users. If it's an easy one-stop place to enter their data, they're more likely to enter more complete data, which will save time on the curation and processing side.
Yep, and all of this is geared towards preventing the development of further backlog. So for the ARO, those submissions from July 1, 2018 on, those are prioritized. You know, they have staffed up since then. They have an organized workflow for those. Those come through quite rapidly, and we stay on top of them as they come through so that we're not developing additional latency in our uploads. So with that, we'll wrap things up. Thank you for having us today, and we'll see what questions have come up.
Thank you, Gabe. Yeah, we did get a couple questions during your presentation. First one is other data sources besides CRM reports, please explain.
Sure. So one of those is, you know, we have access to some of ASM's internal databases. So for these, particularly the projects, you know, we can just run a script and grab all the attributes we need from there. The other one is the ASM library website, LARC. We can also, a key piece of a submission or an upload for us for a project is the associated bibliographic references. So we can scrape those from the ASM library website and generate those as well.
Okay. our next question is, what is your actual backlog? Is it months, years, and how does that affect your AZSITE data?
Well, the backlog submissions went back. I mean, we've been going sort of chronologically. So they, you know, the projects have a project number that begins with the year. So the first year with a large volume of projects that were in the backlog, I think was 2005, 2006. And there was kind of, the backlog was kind of like 200 projects per year from every year from then until 2016, and then a few in 2017, approximately. And like we mentioned, you know, this issue with latency of uploads was talked about early on with AZSITE, so it did develop over quite a bit of time.
Okay. Our next question, relatively simple, but do you guys use Pro?
I know I use Pro.
And you, Gabe?
Yep. That's when I'm doing GIS work. I'm using Pro. I will use desktop if I need to do some of our ArcGIS server management stuff.
Okay. And we also got a compliment and a question combined. Thanks for the great talk and the update. Is there a workflow to update inaccurately mapped project boundaries?
Yeah, so internally, we compile those in bulk. I have a few checks that I run on those before I upload them. Internally, then as we come back through, we have that project entry as kind of a reference point to work against with the sites. And at that point, when we're working on the sites, you know, typically Carrie, sometimes I work on it as well, we'll verify the project boundary. For our users, right now, the procedure is just to contact us directly. We've been testing out a few different paradigms for a data fix request form, ideally a web form, and then a tracking system on the back end for us for those. And then the ARO as well at ASM. A lot of their work is records research that's requested and paid for by contractors. And so in the course of their work, that's where a lot of their curation goes on. And often they will be working with our data and they will notice things and let us know as well.
Okay, great answer, Gabe. Sounds good. And that you guys got a process started. Hopefully you can develop upon it. Somebody else wanted to know is, do you have examples of the Python scripts you used?
Yeah, I mean, we have the script, and we can if people want to reach out to discuss those, or we can remove any any database connection strings and share those as well.
Okay, so just have anybody interested to reach out to you directly?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so if you're on board posing that question, feel free for anybody to reach out to Gabe and want to follow up with everything. It looks like that's all the questions that we have for the two of you. We do have, by the way, Sage, if you're still there, we did get one late question that came in just as we were transitioning from one meeting to, or excuse me, from one presentation to the other. And if you're there, the question is, when creating content for training, how do you make it engaging for your audience and solicit feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as making it engaging for the audience for trainings, I try to make it as hands-on as possible and as interactive as possible. So I just try to really immerse it with interactive activities that whoever is, you know, walking through the training can do while they're reading through it. So whether I've embedded a piece of whatever it is that I'm training them on, so embedding a piece of that in there, or even just kind of putting the data in there for them to even interact with. So that's one of the ways I try to keep it engaging. As far as soliciting feedback, I put all of our contact information in every application, regardless of what exactly it is. But I also try to put out a lot of Survey 123s or Google Forms and stuff like that. So there's no extra steps for giving us feedback on how people feel about it, or how, what they use it for, or anything like that. So I just try to make it as round as possible, I guess.
Okay. Well, hey, I see, Sage,
that
that you shared a link to your presentation that you did earlier today. So thank you for that. We've still got a few minutes left over, but I don't see any additional questions or comments. So I'm going to turn it over to Teresa.
Thanks, Robert. And thank you again, Sage and Gabe and Carrie. Those were great presentations and great questions, actually. And the one about the Python, Gabe, I know who that is. So we'll be in touch with you. I can see all the names that Robert can see. So I just wanted to point out a couple of things. There is a survey for this session. If you guys could see that over on the right-hand side of your attendee hub, we'd greatly appreciate if you fill that out. The recording will be available in a couple of hours. And if you want to reach out to Sage, Gabe, or Carrie, you'll find them under the community attendees under that homepage at the very beginning. So again, thank you guys very much. And I appreciate you taking time and sharing all that with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Teresa. Have a great afternoon, everybody.